A few weeks ago, I reached out to Lonnie Nassiter, who's a member of our congregation. He's the president of Federation, and he was formerly the Midwest director of ADL. I just wanted to get his advice as to who to reach out to at ADL now in order to get them to participate this morning. And he got right back to me and set me in the right direction. At that time, I wanted to discuss the Kanye West controversy, Dave Chappelle's offensive monologue on Saturday Night Live, and then Jon Stewart's subsequent interview on Stephen Colbert. But since this session was set up, well, our former president once again achieved a new low with his despicable dinner guests. Our speaker today is Trent Spoelstra of ADL, and he's going to provide us with a State of the Union in ADL's fight against anti-Semitism. Sadly, it seems like ADL's mission is more challenging with each passing day. So I don't think the ADL is going to close its doors based upon a lack of interest. I think that their mission is going to continue, sadly, for a long, long time. After Trent's presentation, we're going to open the floor for your questions and comments. And Trent, I want to thank you for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Cantor, and thank you all so much for logging in today to hear today's presentation. I should mention as well, too, we actually have a couple of staff members here at ADL who are members at Israel. And I also wanted to give a quick shout out to Officer David Appel, who I work very closely with Chicago Police. I know he's a member here as well. So it's a real pleasure being able to speak to this group, to this congregation today. So I will go ahead and pull up my screen here, but wanted to give just a presentation, I'd say maybe like 35, 40 minutes or so. We're going to go into statistics about anti-Semitism, talk about some current events, what's happening, how, if anyone would like to get involved, how they can do so. And then I definitely want to leave a lot of time for questions and answers and comments and group discussion. So let me go ahead and share my screen, share my presentation here. So just a quick agenda for my presentation. So first, want to give just a few quick minutes, an overview of ADL in terms of who we are and what we do. Oftentimes I've learned there are some misconceptions about what we do, and then there are a lot of things we do that people really aren't aware of. So I want to make sure to voice that. Next, give a very quick overview of some of the big highlights from this year regarding anti-Semitism. And I know today is December 1st. We still have one more month left in the calendar year. Knocking on my wooden desk, I'm hoping nothing major happens. Odds are something probably will, but there's been a lot that's been happening this past year. So we'll do a quick review. After that, I want to go into national and then international anti-Semitic attitudes. So go into data that ADL collects, go into surveys that we collect to see where is the sentiment in the United States and around the world regarding anti-Semitism. After that, I will go into what's called our annual audit of anti-Semitic instances. We have done this since 1979. This is a report that comes out every spring. And unfortunately, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but 2021, we saw the numbers from last year were not good. And I imagine our next report that comes out next spring for this calendar year, the numbers are still going to be incredibly high. Afterwards, talk about some ways for people to get involved with ADL. Like I said, definitely want to leave a lot of time for questions and answers for today. So first, Anti-Defamation League. We have been around since 1913. So we've been around for well over a century. We are not only a national, but now in fact an international organization. We do work in Europe. We actually have an office over in Israel as well. But we were founded right here in Chicago. So here in the Midwest office, we like to point out it was Sigmund Livingston, who was a lawyer here in Chicago, founded the Anti-Defamation League. And from 1913 up to present day, our mission has remained the same, which is number one, to stop the defamation of the Jewish people. And equally as important, and something we focused in on a lot as an organization over the last few years with our new-ish CEO, Jonathan Greenblatt, which is to secure justice and fair treatment for all people. It's been our mission since 1913. It remains that mission up to today. ADL, you guys are the Jewish Civil Rights Organization, right? That's usually when I talk with people who've heard of ADL or might be a little bit familiar. That's how ADL is most well known, and that's what we were known for decades. And civil rights is one part of what we do, but in fact, we really like to think of ourselves as America's leading anti-hate organization. So civil rights is one part of what we do, but really at the end of the day, we fight hate. And I'll talk about in a minute all the different ways that we do that. But we are a nonprofit and a nonpartisan organization. So we are a 501c3 organization. We have 25 regional offices all across the United States. And I actually have a map here that kind of breaks down how we break down the country. But I show this to folks to show that whether it's north, south, east, west, coast to coast, we cover hate in all 50 states. We also have an office, like I said, over in Israel, and we do work in Europe as well. Even though we were founded here in Chicago, like many Jewish organizations, we are now headquartered in New York. And when we say ADL Midwest, I beg your pardon. When we say ADL Midwest, we're actually referring, I'll go back here, to this kind of, as you can see, kind of this greenish spot specifically. So the kind of the tannish green color. So we serve all the way from Indiana to the Dakotas down to Kansas. So we actually cover about 8.5 states in our office headquartered here in Chicago. So what do we fight? So while I will be focusing in on anti-Semitism today specifically, I wanted to make clear that when we say we are an anti-hate organization, we fight hate in all of its forms. Of course, being Jewish founded, anti-Semitism is a big part of what we do, but we also fight extremism from the far left to the far right of the political spectrum. We fight racism. We fight homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia. We fight bigotry and bias. So before it works its way up to hatred, so to speak, we want to challenge people on their bias and bigotry and discrimination. And for the last 25 years or so, with the proliferation of the internet, in the last, I'd say 10 to 15 years with the proliferation of social media, we are increasing our outreach more and more in fighting cyber hate. So I want to make clear that it's not just anti-Semitism that we fight all forms of hate, and we are in person, online, we fight extremism. We do a ton. If hate is involved, odds are ADL is there to combat it. So how do we fight hate? I could spend an entire presentation on this slide alone. Obviously not going to do that. But to best sum up all the programs, all the initiatives, all of the actions that we take at ADL, it's what I like to call our 3 8s, if you will. We investigate, we educate, and we advocate. That's where our 3 8s are. Regarding investigation, within ADL, one of our crown jewels, as I like to think of it, is called our Center on Extremism, or COE for short. And our COE is kind of an inner think tank, if you will. And the job of people in our Center on Extremism, it's made up of literally dozens of analysts. And their job day in and day out is to track extremism and to track hate groups. And when I say that we track hate groups, what I mean is that we will track their websites, we will track their blog posts, we track their social media accounts, we follow newspapers, any publicly available information we can get our hands on, our analysts get our hands on, because we want to know what hate groups are doing, what they're saying, and equally more important, what they might be possibly planning to where it crosses that line from legitimate First Amendment speech to now they're planning potentially violent acts. So we monitor a lot of hate groups within ADL. Regarding education, we are in K through 12 schools. We have a program called No Place for Hate, which is an anti-hate program in general. We do trainings on bias and bullying in schools. We are in classrooms in college. We have a program called Hate Uncycled, which will train college administrators and staff on how to address hate on campus. And then interesting enough, ADL, we have great partnerships with law enforcement agencies. In fact, ADL, we are the largest nonprofit organization in the US that will train law enforcement. We've been doing this for literally decades, and we have trained literally tens of thousands of police officers on the local, state, and national level. And we train them on things such as hate crimes and extremism, managing implicit bias. So we've done a number of trainings. And then finally, we advocate. I know the word lobbying is not the most positive term in our modern American language, understandably so, but the kind of lobbying that we do is we lobby for anti-hate legislation. We lobby for funding for things like the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, which gives grants to houses of worship to provide security. right? We work with government officials to keep them up to date on what's going on and to advocate for bills and measures that we think will help reduce hate in society. So like I said, I know historically we've been known as a civil rights organization and taking on cases, but in fact, we do way more than that. We're investigating, we're educating, and we're advocating as well. Okay, so getting into anti-Semitism specifically, right? This year has definitely been a huge year on the local level and the national level of major anti-Semitic instances. And just kind of review the year, going back all the way to January, 2 weeks into the year, we had the event in Colleyville, Texas, right? I remember I was at home, like many people were. I know people were out celebrating Shabbat. A synagogue in Colleyville, Texas was taken hostage. And for 12 hours, we saw on the news what was taking place. And thank goodness nobody was hurt, right? There was not, it turned out to be a successful operation where they were able to bring everybody out. But that was kind of how the year started. And little did we know that that was going to be just the first of many instances that were going to take place throughout the year. A couple of weeks after Colleyville, late January, early February, we received reports within a 72-hour period of the neighborhood of West Rogers Park. We saw a kosher grocery store being vandalized. There was vandalism of a couple of Orthodox schools. A couple of people, Orthodox individuals that were heading on their way to Shabbat were harassed. This was all within a 72-hour period in late January, early February. So that happened just a couple of weeks after the Colleyville incident. Fast forward to the spring. We saw specifically in the North Shore area, right? So like Northfield, but then also nationwide, a major proliferation of these anti-Semitic flyers that were going out all over the country. And there were people who have reported to us and still report to us of these flyers showing up in their neighborhoods or showing up in parks or public places. These flyers that are demonstrated, this is one example of specifically a group called the Goyim Defense League or other right-wing groups that will put these flyers in baggies. They'll put rocks in because they want to make sure that these flyers don't fly all over the place. But some of just very vile anti-Semitic imagery and language that have been used in these flyers. We started seeing them here in the North Shore earlier this spring. And like I said, this has actually been a national phenomenon taking place. That's an example of right-wing anti-Semitism. Then there have also been examples of left-wing anti-Semitism, so anti-Israel, anti-Zionism bias. I think it was the first or second day of school. There was an incident at the University of Wisconsin-Madison of a chalking incident that took place. There were anti-Israel groups on campus, like Students for Justice in Palestine, other groups of that nature, who thought it'd be a really good idea to put a bunch of anti-Israel, and we'd argue anti-Semitic images, chalking on sidewalks on campus. And if that was not bad enough, they then specifically start calling out groups like Hillel and Chabad and other organizations, saying that it's your blood of the Palestinians on your hands because you associate with pro-Israel groups. We argue at ADL that's an example of anti-Semitism, of collective guilt, of blaming all Jews for the actions of the Israeli government or the Israeli military. That happened, I think it was day 1 or day 2 for students at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Fast forward a little further now, getting into early fall up to present day. President Trump, who historically over the last several years has made obviously a number of controversial statements on his Twitter account. I think it was early October, where he made the account basically calling out the entire American Jewish population, saying that you're not loyal enough to Israel, right? You need to, he literally says, U.S. Jews have to get their act together and appreciate what I've done for Israel before it's too late, right? We argue this is an example of anti-Semitic tropes. The idea that as Jews, we are a monolithic group, one calling out our appreciation or loyalty to Israel, but then 2, assuming that all Jews think exactly alike when it comes to Israel. Then the incident that happened actually just a couple weeks ago in Waukegan, in a cemetery, where there was swastika graffiti spray painted on the gravestones of Jewish individuals that had passed away. You don't see it in the photo here. This leads to my next slide. One spray painted image that was put on these gravestones literally said Kanye or Ye was right. So not only was it bad enough that there were swastikas being spray painted, but then the person who ever did this spray painted on one of the stones, Kanye was right. And then that leads into my last slide, probably the one that's most well known over the last couple of weeks, the statement that was made by Ye, formerly known as Kanye West, and then the Kyrie Irving incident that popped up as well. Regarding Kanye West, Ye, right? The image, clearly this is an example of somebody who has gone way too far. And this is not even like, is this borderline anti-Semitic? Is this problematic? Like, this is an example of a threat that was made, anti-Semitic tropes and stereotypes that were made and that were put out there. What is particularly troubling for ADL's perspective is that not just are these comments are offensive, but the fact that when these comments were made, and I'm not sure what his total now is, there are over 30 million people that follow Kanye West or Ye on Twitter. So there were 30 million people who woke up that day and saw this image. Equally disturbing was Kyrie Irving, very prominent professional basketball player, posted about a documentary that a lot of people had never heard of before, very, very low budget documentary called Hebrews to Negroes. And in this documentary, it brings up a number of anti-Semitic tropes, images that denial of the Holocaust or saying the Holocaust wasn't that big of a deal, a lot of things that were problematic. Kyrie Irving watched this documentary, posted on his Twitter. Equally problematic, there are about 4 to 5 million people that follow Kyrie Irving on Twitter. So that is a review, and I know Cantor Simon had pointed out there were comments were made regarding Jon Stewart and comments of Dave Chappelle, other things that have been taking place, but number of instances, number of major news stories that have taken place just in this year alone. Okay. So next, I want to go into the data to show, and this is something that we work with government officials when we tell people. Obviously, I just shared a bunch of anecdotal stories of things that have been taking place this year. Here at ADL, we do a lot of top-notch research and data because we want to show people that these aren't just a bunch of stories that are happening. We have data to back up the fact that anti-Semitism is in fact on the rise and has been for a number of years here in the United States. So first, especially when I do this presentation and similar things to non-Jewish audiences, I want to make sure people know what we define as anti-Semitism. And like many major Jewish organizations, ADL, we adhere to what is called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition, or IRA definition. And in this definition, it was created, I think, about 10, 15 years ago by an international committee, but they give a very kind of general, all-encompassing definition about anti-Semitism. But equally important, within that definition, they then give concrete contemporary examples of anti-Semitism. And I wanted to highlight 3, but they give, I think, 12 in total on the list. But some of these include understanding Holocaust denial, which in 2022 is still a problem. We see that on the far left. We see that on the far right of the political spectrum. People downplaying the Holocaust or even saying it didn't even really happen. The idea of dual loyalty, that as Jews, at the end of the day, our allegiance to America is questioned because we support and we love and have an affinity for Israel. And then number 3, an example of what Donald Trump had used, the idea of holding all Jews responsible for the actions of what is happening in Israel, arguing that we are a monolithic group and we support everything the Israeli government does or everything the Israeli military does. That's problematic as well, too. These are some concrete examples. When I show people, I try to explain to people, what does modern day anti-Semitism look like today? So here, I guess there is one little silver lining before we get to kind of the big numbers, and that we have done surveys over every 3 years or so, going back to the 1960s, to see where sentiment is in the United States regarding anti-Semitism. And I guess if there was one small caveat is that the numbers, the anti-Semitic sentiment in the United States is not as high as it was in, say, 50, 60 years ago. All right, so as you can see in this graphic, we see the numbers kind of go down, they go up. And so it's usually with current events, with things going on around the world, we'll see anti-Semitism spike or we see a drop. And unfortunately right now, and I'll get to in a couple of minutes, that we are seeing and have been seeing for a number of years, anti-Semitic feelings and actions spiking here in the United States. Even though sentiment is down in the United States compared to where it was maybe 50, 60 years ago, there are still some, based on our latest surveys, what I call very stubborn stereotypes or tropes that a lot of Americans still hold about us as Jews. So things such as 1/4 of Americans still believe that Jews are responsible for the death of Jesus. Not only is that problematic, it's also historically inaccurate. A quarter of Americans, this goes back to dual loyalty, believe that as Jews, at the end of the day, we're more loyal to Israel than America, questioning our allegiance, and our patriotism to America. 20%, and being a former high school history teacher, this one always blows my mind, about 20% believe as Jews that we talk way too much about the Holocaust, which is problematic as surveys have been done of Gen Z and people who are in high school now to show that their knowledge of the Holocaust is not anywhere where it really should be. 15%, one out of 8 believe Jews have too much power in the business world. 1 out of 10 believe that we have too much control over the US government. So if there was one, and I try to see the positives in things, if there was one silver lining in this, I mean, none of these numbers are 51%. Majority of Americans aren't believing certain things. But even then, when you have 250,000 Americans who believe in dual loyalty, we're talking about 80 to 85 million Americans who question our allegiance. That's problematic, right? There are still millions and millions of Americans who still believe certain stereotypes that have now existed for decades, if not centuries. So that's the national sentiment. What about the international sentiment? So every few years, ADL conducts what is called our Global 100 survey. And we will conduct phone interviews with people around the world to judge where their anti-Semitic attitudes are, how they feel about Jews. And here's the thing, all right? We can't exactly call up someone in Argentina or France and ask, hey, are you anti-Semitic, yes or no, right? Very few people, I think, would openly admit that they're anti-Semites. So what we do is we will ask or make these 11 statements that you see here on your screen. And in this survey, if some individual answers yes to 6 out of the 11, so a majority of these statements, we then believe that that person probably harbors anti-Semitic feelings. And some of these statements are really out there, right? I won't read all of them, but some of them are Jews have too much power in the business world. They think they're better than other people. They have too much control of the US government. They're responsible for world wars, right? So one of the things I tell people is if you were to answer yes to 6 out of 11 of these, you're probably anti-Semitic, odds are, or you have very, very strong feelings against Jews. So to give you an idea of where sentiment is around the world, these are our 2019 numbers, so from about 3 years ago, I wanted to give you a snapshot of 6 different countries around the world. So we have Canada, our neighbor to the north, Germany representing Western Europe, Poland, Eastern Europe. We have Russia, of course, and then 2 developing countries that are growing in prominence in the 21st century, South Africa and Brazil. The next slide I'll show you shows you percentages, and these percentages are based on our surveys, the percentages of people in these countries that probably harbor anti-Semitic beliefs. Okay. And here are our results. The good news is based off these surveys, very low levels of anti-Semitism in Canada. In Germany, for instance, of course, we know Germany was home of the Nazi Party, Adolf Hitler, etc. Germany, to its credit, after World War II to present day, has done a lot to own up to what happened with Nazism, what happened with the Holocaust, what happened with the rise of Hitler. And as a result of that, very few people in Germany today harbor anti-Semitic beliefs. After that, I would argue the numbers get a little concerning. So in Poland, for instance, even though the Polish Jewish population obviously is not anywhere near it was but pre-World War II, you still have about half of Poles, according to our surveys, that still harbor anti-Semitic beliefs. In Russia, for instance, I know we're all very familiar with the Refusnik movement of the 1970s. After the wall came down and the Soviet Union collapsed, a number of Russian Jews left for Israel and here in the United States. Even today, about 1/3 of Russians harbor anti-Semitic beliefs. And I would argue for people in my generation or younger, as we see the rise of countries like South Africa and Brazil, these are countries in South Africa, for instance, that once did have a large Jewish population, no longer does. And in a country like Brazil that does not have a large Jewish population. And yet when you look at these 2 countries, South Africa, about half of South Africans harbor anti-Semitic beliefs. And in Brazil, 1/4 harbor anti-Semitic beliefs. So I like showing this to people to demonstrate that anti-Semitism, it's not just a problem here in the United States. It's not just a problem in Middle Eastern countries that border Israel. It's a problem in countries that no longer have large Jewish populations, haven't had them for decades, or countries that have never had large Jewish populations. And anti-Semitism, the feeling of anti-Semitism exists really, truly worldwide. Regarding anti-Semitism, anti-Israel rhetoric, so specifically looking at far left anti-Semitism, right? One of the things that we teach at ADL and we're very clear about, is that here at ADL, we believe that not all criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, right? You can find, I'm sure here on this call, we all have various opinions on certain Israeli policies on this or that, right? But then the question is, then when does that criticism of Israel cross the line? One of the things that we teach, and I've taught this to teenagers, I teach this to non-Jewish audiences, is that here at ADL, we try to follow like one of three kind of guidelines. Number one, when Israel's right to existence is questioned, or people argue that Israel shouldn't exist, we argue that to be anti-Semitic. Number two, this idea of collective guilt or collective responsibility, that all Jews should be held responsible for the actions of the Israeli government. And then number three, using traditional anti-Semitic imagery to then criticize Israel. And if I could argue if there was one image that showed that perfectly, it would be this one on the right, as disturbing as it is. All right, so we argue here at ADL, criticizing Israel or policies is one thing. Crossing the line is when you are denying Israel's right to exist or questioning it, collective guilt, collective responsibility, and then using traditional anti-Semitic imagery as well. Okay. So every year, going back to 1979, like I said, here at ADL, we are very data-driven. We want to make sure when we go out and talk to the public and talk to government officials, we have the data to back up that what we are saying. Every year since 1979, ADL has conducted a report that is called our Audit of Anti-Semitic Incidences. And the report comes out every spring. So the numbers I will show you are from 2021. The numbers for this calendar year will be coming out sometime next March or April. Okay. So when we say an incident specifically, we're talking about three specific actions that we look at in our audit. We look at harassment, right? So verbal, right? Verbal assault or writings about conspiracy theories, things on social media, for instance. We look at vandalism, so physical destruction of property, swastika graffiti, for instance. And then we look at assault, so actual like physical confrontation, physical violence. So the numbers I'll show you here in a second, I want to give you a breakdown. About 2/3 of the numbers were harassment, about 1/3 were vandalism, and then a very low level that existed with assault. But here's the disturbing part that we've been trying to tell people and be talking about for a number of months now. Like I said, we've been doing this survey every year since 1979 for almost 45 years. Last year was the highest number of anti-Semitic instances that we have ever recorded since we started doing this on an annual basis, by far the highest. And I wish I could say that last year was a fluke year, it was an anomaly, right? It was just kind of an odd year. Unfortunately, that is not the case, because when you go back to the last 10, 12 years or so, we were not seeing these high numbers of anti-Semitic actions. We started seeing a turn in about 2015, 2016, and that number has continued to grow and grow and grow. Last year, for instance, we recorded over 2,700 acts of vandalism, assault, or harassment in the United States. To put that another way, that is roughly 6 anti-Semitic acts per day. Now, like I mentioned, by far, these were some of the highest numbers, and in fact, the highest year that we've seen the highest total since we started doing this survey in 1979. We also, most people ask, well, it's got to be happening in one state. It's got to be happening in one region. It can't be happening here, right? This map actually, this is a very detailed audit report that comes out. It's like 40, 50 pages. We even have a page in the back about our methodology to explain how we determine cases and things of that nature. But one of the things that we do is we break down the cases per state. And what you're seeing on this map is the countries that are colored, the states that are colored in yellow are the top 20 states that saw the highest numbers of anti-Semitic acts. And one of the things that you will notice is that there is yellow all over the map. It's not just in one region. It's not just in cities that have big populations or large Jewish populations. It's in states like Colorado, for instance. In Colorado, they do obviously have a Jewish population in the Denver, Aurora area, but not to the level that we have here in Chicago. Colorado had 92 reported cases. Minnesota, same thing. There is a Jewish population in the Minneapolis, St. Paul area, not to the size that we have here in Chicago. And yet in Minneapolis, there were 75 cases. One of the things that I try to explain to people is it's not one state, it's not one region in the United States. It's not just in cities or states that have large Jewish populations. We're seeing anti-Semitism all across the board. So I'm guessing by now, this is usually the part of the presentation I can look at faces and I can tell people are asking why now? What's going on? Why are we seeing such a rise in anti-Semitism? And the simple answer is that I don't have a simple answer. We don't here at ADL. Trust me, we wish we did. It would make our jobs a lot easier that we can pinpoint our directions here. But we would argue that it's probably a combination of three things happening right now in our society of why we're seeing such a rise in hate, but then specifically in anti-Semitism. So number one, looking at the political and social environment. Over the last 6-7 years, we've had, regardless of wherever you fall politically, we've had 2 controversial presidential elections. We've been dealing with, obviously, a pandemic that the world has not seen in over a century. We saw a recession in 2020. We saw racial civil unrest in 2020 with the murder of George Floyd and those subsequent protests, in some cases riots that took place. We have seen a recession. We're now going through the worst inflation in 40 years. Odds are we're going to have another recession sometime next year. And so putting all these things together, there's been a lot of fear. And I think there's been a lot of just unease in the country. And I'm not a psychologist by any stretch of the imagination, but there's something within human nature that when things fall apart or it feels like our world's falling apart around us, we have to blame someone. There's just something about human nature that it has to be somebody's fault that I lost my job. It has to be somebody's fault that this COVID pandemic's happening. It has to be somebody's fault that we're in this war. All right. And one of the things that we argue at ADL is that we would argue as a Jewish people, oftentimes we are what's called, the phrase canary in a coal mine. That when hate spikes and we see hate start to rise in this country and around the world, Jews are one of, if not the first marginalized group that gets targeted. And after Jews, other groups that are targeted are people of color, people of various sexual orientations, immigrants, the poor, other groups. But usually the first, if not the very first group that gets blamed are us as Jews. Second, looking at the internet and looking at social media. 20 years ago, and this is the nice thing with technology, any new technology, it's not necessarily a good or a bad thing, but how it's being used. I'm sure many of you probably have friends or relatives around the world. I know I do as well. It's amazing. I have friends over in Israel that I can contact with a text message in a matter of seconds. You couldn't do that 20 years ago, right? Thanks to social media and Facebook and things of that nature. The problem is, as we all are using social media for friendships and acquaintances and things of that nature, we know that hate groups and very hateful individuals are also using social media to blast their vile. And because of that, we have tried at ADL, we've tried working with Meta, with Facebook, we've tried working with other social media platforms to say, please stop allowing hate groups to use your platforms to spread their hate. It has been an ongoing battle. We are still battling it to this day, and I'm happy to talk about it more in Q&A. It has been something that we have continued to work with, but with this advent of social media, people can spread, and celebrities like Kanye West and celebrities like Kyrie Irving can spread a message to millions of people in the flick of a second. And then finally, ignorance. Right? We are very fortunate here in Chicago to live in a city that has a significant Jewish population. But I think sometimes we forget as an American Jewish community that we make up about 2% of the American population. And because of that, there are probably millions of Americans who still have never met a Jewish person, and they've never interacted with somebody who is Jewish. And all they really have to go off of is what they've seen in a movie and what they've seen on a television show, or maybe what they've seen on YouTube or social media, right? And if that impression is not a good one, odds are somebody will go down the rabbit hole, so to speak, and they look up more and more videos and more anti-Semitic things. And before you know it, that person has their mind made up and they say, Jews are horrible people. So why is this happening? It's probably a combination of these three things taking place right now. But I argue definitely the environment that we've been living in here in the United States for the last 6-7 years. And then finally, how you can help. Working with ADL or working to try to reduce the level of hate and anti-Semitism happening across the US. First, so besides doing these presentations, I run a number of programs for ADL Midwest, and I'm happy to talk about this with Cantors Simon at a later date, but we have a program called our Signature Synagogue Program. And this was established a few years ago. We brought it here to the Midwest office last year, but it is a program where we build strong partnerships between our office and synagogues. As of right now, we have, I think by latest count, there are 19 or 20 synagogues I work with across 3 different states. There are a number of synagogues I work with on the North Shore. Would love to have Am Israel join and this partnership and with benefits as we work together. Second, reporting a hate incident. If you see something, to say something. All right. The cases I went back and I talked about the 2,700 instances of anti-Semitism. Those were acts, if you will, of ones that were reported. Right. Those are not all the ones that probably happened in the United States. And so we tell people to please report that if you see something, to say something, because we want to make sure we have the most accurate data possible. Whether for number 3, going to K through 12 schools, if you know K through 12 schools in the area that you live in, we would love to connect with schools to promote No Place for Hate and to promote anti-bias education. Making your voice heard in Congress. We have a website, so ADL Advocacy. When certain measures, pieces of legislation pop up throughout the year, you can send a quick email to your member of Congress and it'll go directly to them, or you can send an email to your state legislator. Training sessions for clubs or civic groups that you are a part of. In addition to doing this presentation, I've done a number of presentations throughout this year, actually, where I talk with non-Jewish audiences and I talk about the basics of Judaism with them. And I talk about the basics of Jewish people. And I cannot tell you, I've done this a number of times now throughout this year, and everybody leaves there learning something new that they didn't know about Jewish people. That helps try to solve the ignorance part for people to understand who we really are as a people. And then finally, we do have our newsletter that you can sign up for. We're on social media ourselves too there. And so with that, wanted to give my contact information, and I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen. But no, I appreciate your time, and I am happy to open up for questions and answers during this time. So thank you all.
Great. Thank you, Trent. I'd like to suggest that for the questions, the way that we can keep this structured is that you just get that yellow hand put up on your screen so that you can ask your questions, and then I can call on you, and then Trent can address those things. But I'm going to take liberty in a couple of things before we get started, because one thing, if we wanted, we talked about some of the venom that is being spewed by individuals like Kanye West, Kyrie Irving, but there was something that was actually sort of positive, and I invite you to go Google it just to see it. You probably are familiar with who John Mellencamp is, former rocker. Was John, at one time he was John Cougar Mellencamp, then he was John Cougar, now he's John Mellencamp. But he was involved in the induction ceremony of a Jewish lawyer into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And he used his pulpit there to talk about anti-Semitism. He did it in, using some vulgarity, but I'm sure that people have heard that before, so I don't think you're going to be offended by it. But look at his major message, where he was really standing in unity with the Jewish community about combating anti-Semitism. And he had some very strong words to anybody who was anti-Semitic. So it's Mellencamp. And you might want to Google that, so that as we talk about all those people who are saying terrible things about us, it's also nice when people can use their notoriety, their familiarity by saying good things about Jews and supporting us. There's been a lot said lately about adjusting curricula in schools. A lot of false information about schools teaching CRT, critical race theory. And I think a lot of those people who are carrying banners at schools and complaining about it don't have a clue as to what that is.
Yeah.
Frankly, I'm a cynic by nature. I think that there are a lot of people who are saying that Jews are too obsessed with the Holocaust, probably not only know nothing about the Holocaust, but couldn't really tell you who fought in World War II. Those are people who are now going to school boards demanding that things get taken out of history books because they might be seen as offensive to students and upset them or upset their ancestors. So let's not talk about the Holocaust, let's not talk about slavery, etc. So I guess my question to you, Trent, is the ADL doing anything to try to address these requested modifications in schools that, you know, if you don't teach history, then history will indeed repeat itself? Can you address that, please?
Absolutely. Yeah, Cantor, thank you for asking that, because there are a couple of examples I'll give that demonstrate as school districts are trying to figure out what critical race theory, oftentimes there's still a lot of misconceptions around the phrase itself. And it's, I would argue, too, kind of a misnomer in a sense. Of course, critical race theory is actually legal theory that's developed in law school. I think it's been what's been happening with curriculum of teaching about racism and anti-Semitism, things like that. It all gets thrown into this umbrella that is CRT. But given a couple examples of what ADL does, for instance, there was, I think it was back in March or April when the Indiana General Assembly was getting together, there was a state senator or state representative who made the case on the floor of basically saying, I don't want teachers to express their opinions in class. I just want them to teach the facts, right? And I just teach the facts about Nazism and communism and all these other things. I don't want to hear all this other stuff. And we argued, he had also said something along the lines of, if it's controversial, you have to teach both sides or something. There was something just very like, this is ridiculous. This is ridiculous. All right. And we actually called him out. We were actually quoted, I think, in the Indy Star, if I remember correctly, my boss, David Goldenberg, who's our regional director in the Midwest, where we argued that there's nothing controversial about Nazism. It was horrible. There is no other side to learn about Nazism. There's no other side to learn about communism and other extremisms that exist in the world that were responsible for the deaths of literally tens of millions of people, right? That is one example. There's another example similar in not our region, but in Westlake, Texas. So actually, I used to live in Texas for several years. It's right outside of Austin. And there's a school principal or superintendent, same thing, where his interpretation was, well, if it's a controversial issue, you have to discuss both sides of it. And according to that logic, and I don't know the full story, I'm hoping the principal didn't mean harm, but I think in his mind was like, okay, well, the Holocaust and Nazism, these are controversial topics. I guess we have to explain both sides of them. No, once again, like you don't need to learn the side of the Nazis to explain why they did what they did. I think we can all be in agreement that what they did was horrific and was horrible, right? These are examples of things that school districts are trying to wrestle with. And Cantor Simon, thank you for pointing that out, that I get it. We live in a society today where more and more we don't want to talk about controversial topics. We don't want to talk about things that are uncomfortable. And as someone who's a former high school history teacher, I can tell you that's the point of education. It's to talk about things that are controversial and hard to talk about. And yes, it is hard and it is uncomfortable. And in fact, I'll give an example. I taught an entire week in spring semester when I was my AP World History class, and we talked about the Holocaust for an entire week. And I told my students, yeah, this is going to be an uncomfortable week. You're going to see images that are uncomfortable, and you're going to hear things that are uncomfortable. But we're teaching you these things to make sure that history does not repeat itself, that we learn from our past mistakes and we do better in the future. So that's the personal side. But no, ADL, we do, when things happen, specifically with anti-Semitism or banning certain books, yeah, we're going to speak out about it, because that's the point of education, to learn things, to learn the good and the bad and the ugly, and hopefully not repeat the things that we did bad in the past.
Thank you. I'm going to call on people, but I don't know who raised his or her hand first, so I'm just going to go with what I see. So I'm going to start with Vera, and then we'll go to Jeff, to Dan, and then to Howard. Vera, unmute, please. And
Hi, yes. Jen, I want to ask you if you collaborate or work with Stand With Us organization, because they do a lot of work on college campuses fighting anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism.
Absolutely. Thank you for asking that. So we probably on the national level, there is some collaboration. I do know that we have a head of our international affairs department, and there is, I think, a roundtable that they meet, all the national representatives, once a week, to try to figure out what's happening on which campus, what ways we can work together, like who's kind of taking lead on what things. So ADL, we definitely do work on some college campuses, and we actually have a partnership with Hillel, to do different like educational modules and things like that. But like I said, one of the key parts that we have is our Hate Uncycled program, because we know there are groups like Stand With Us, we know APAC's on campus, other groups are on campus. So the lane that we've tried to find here at ADL is, because we're an anti-hate organization, let's teach anti-hate in general. Anti-Semitism is one part of that, but we know that there is hateful, whether it's xenophobia, racism, homophobia, transphobia happening on college campuses. Let's teach people how to combat hate in general, and that hopefully that will benefit not just Jewish people, but all people on campus. But yeah, there is some collaboration with different Jewish organizations for sure.
Thank you. I have another question.
Yes.
When my husband and I were attended a speech at the Holocaust Museum by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs several years ago, he was talking about how in Britain they support teaching of Holocaust in high schools, in whatever organizations, and that even government support or provide help for high school kids to go and visit camps. At the same time, there is a rampant anti-Semitism in Britain. How can you explain that?
Yeah.
I mean, teaching doesn't seem to be helping.
That's a good point. I would argue. So here at ADL, we work with Yad Vashem. We actually work with the USC Shoah Foundation. We have a program called Echoes and Reflections. I didn't mention it in my presentation, but it's a program where we will provide, largely for free, we will provide training sessions, training modules. We even provide curriculum for teachers across the United States to teach on the Holocaust. Another thing that we do as well historically is, because education is on the state level, we have to work with each individual state if we want to mandate Holocaust education. And thanks to our efforts, there are a number of states where on the books, they have to teach the Holocaust. There are still, I think by last count, 10 to 12 states in the US that do not mandate it. And it's a little misconceiving, because even though it might be mandated on the state level, you can go to one school district, and I can say this as a former teacher, you can go to one classroom or one school district, they may be talking about the Holocaust for a week. You might go to another school and they talk about it for one period. And like, here's this worksheet, I don't want to talk about it, right? So part of it is, it's kind of in steps, in the sense of let's mandate it on a state level. But then next, we're going to try to reach as many teachers as we possibly can to say, yes, I know this is an uncomfortable topic and you may not like talking about it. We will help you. Right? We will provide lesson plans. We will help with teaching you how to discuss this, because there are a lot of kids these days that are not learning just the very basics of the Holocaust and basic facts. So I'd argue that it's one of those things that's an ongoing struggle. And I think it's also, there are a lot of kids who will go on social media and they go on TikTok and they go on YouTube and they watch all these horrible videos. I think a part of that is too, of countering what they're seeing on television or what they're seeing online, to say, not everything you're seeing online is in fact. So part of that is reaching as many people as we possibly can to share the facts with them, to share what happened, why this is important.
Thank you, Trent.
Okay. Jeff?
Yeah, I want to make a comment, and then maybe Trent or others could respond to it. And it's about Dave Chappelle and Jon Stewart. And I found Dave Chappelle's statement, it presents a more subtle problem, certainly, than Kanye West. And I'm not going to give Kanye West the respect of saying that his name is now Ye. He doesn't deserve respect from anyone. He's either an evil person or a crazy person or both. I think Kylie Irving's statement was pretty bad too. I don't know whether he's evil or just plain stupid. But Dave Chappelle made a statement that was not nearly so overtly anti-Semitic. And I happened to see it. And when he started to talk about Jews, I started to feel uncomfortable. And when I'm present for somebody making an anti-Semitic statement, I feel it physically. Something happens to me physically. And when he got to the part when he said, and I think the statement he made was, and he said it very emphatically, there are a lot of Jews in Hollywood. And my body just chilled from that. And I take that as an anti-Semitic statement. But I'm not quite sure logically why that's so anti-Semitic. And I'm reminded of the fact that in 1988, Neil Gabler, a Jewish person, wrote a wonderful book entitled An Empire of Their Own, How the Jews Created Hollywood. If that wasn't anti-Semitic, why is Kanye West's statement anti-Semitic? And then the other part of all this is I also saw Jon Stewart when he was on Stephen Colbert. And I think Jon Stewart is great. I mean, he's so funny. His politics are wonderful. He's spoken out about so many things. He's been a leader in that regard. And I think Stephen Colbert has pretty good politics too. But neither of them were very critical of David Chappelle at all. And I was so disappointed, particularly in Jon Stewart, for not calling out Dave Chappelle. And what I took away from what both of them were kind of saying or implying was they didn't want to say too much about Dave Chappelle because they think comedians should have freedom of speech and they shouldn't be criticized. And I was very disappointed in Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert for not criticizing Dave Chappelle. So those are my feelings about that situation. I wonder if Trent or others have any responses to that.
Yeah, no, I could say, I mean, definitely here at ADL, we believe, of course, we also follow the Constitution like everyone else, and you'll find, yes, we have civil rights lawyers on our staff. We also believe in the First Amendment, right? And one of the things that I explain to people, I tell people that not all, right, it's case by case, but a lot of hate speech is considered free speech, right? People have a right to say those things. However, at the same time, now that especially we live in this advent of social media and you can spread your message to millions of people in the snap of a finger, words matter, right? Yes, you have, Kanye had the right to say what he wanted to say, and Dave Chappelle had the right to say what he wanted to say and things of that nature. However, there are millions of people who follow these individuals, and there are people who don't know the full story and quite honestly are ignorant in their sense that they were probably hateful to begin with. And when celebrities say these things, and we know celebrities have power in our society, the reason why Adidas and Gatorade and so many other products out there use celebrities, so they know celebrities have influence, they have power. And because words matter, when celebrities are saying horrible things or they say things that are borderline inappropriate, people listen. And people take that as the gospel truth. And people say, well, I guess that must be the case, right? And that's why ADL, when we fight, I know people look at us and they say, why are you guys so politically correct? Why are you guys against the First Amendment? And that's not the case at all. We're not against the First Amendment, but we recognize that especially if you are an influencer and you are a celebrity and you have millions of people following you, you should probably watch what you're saying. Or before you post something, probably make sure that what you're posting is not a very anti-Semitic and also very factually incorrect documentary like Kyrie Irving did.
Yeah, I am sorry to interrupt or jump in, but I'm someone who I taught constitutional law and freedom of speech for many years, and I'm a strong advocate of freedom of speech. These are not freedom of speech questions. Freedom of speech means that the government cannot penalize you for saying something.
Right.
But when somebody says that doesn't mean, just because you have the right to say it free from government restriction, doesn't mean that you should say it and that it's okay to say it and it's not offensive to say it. So what we're talking about is, you have the right to say it, but we all have the right to respond to it. We have freedom of speech too. And Jon Stewart has the right to say to Dave Chappelle, I think what you said was wrong, was offensive. And Jon Stewart didn't do that. And I'm really disappointed in him. And, I don't think anyone, and I would never say that you don't have the right to say these things. But all that means is that the government can't penalize you for it. It doesn't mean, that sponsors can take away your sponsorship, and it certainly doesn't mean that others can't react to it.
Yep.
I think that Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert, and all these sponsors should be reacting to what the people say.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that reminds me too, when you talk about reacting to what people say or what they do. What has bothered me, and then I see we have a number of other hands up, but what bothers me in terms of the reaction to this meeting that Trump had with these anti-Semites is all the individuals, frankly, in the Republican side who had the opportunity to criticize what he did, but have chosen to remain mute. And I feel that, by being mute, they're complicit. It's like being a Nazi sympathizer. If people are going to say things or do things that are that blatantly anti-Semitic, but refuse to talk or say, I don't know anything about it, and change the subject, or be an apologist for it, with factually inaccurate information, like what Kevin McCarthy was doing. I'd like to see those individuals called out, called out strongly. And I know that sometimes it's a delicate political position to do so, but I think if he walks like a duck and talks like a duck, he's a duck. So let's, if there's a politician who's refusing to comment on this and refusing to call it out, then as far as I'm concerned, they're part of the same club. Dan?
So the hard part about this group, which I love, is that there's so many things you want to comment on that other people say, but then you want to get back to the thing you want to say in the first place. I first wanted to say, Trent, it's so good to see you actually in action. Trent was the deputy regional when I was the chair of the Glass Leadership Committee Institute, and it's great to see you here. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
And great presentation. So to work backwards now, it was nice to see that the Zionist Organization of America and finally, like some Jewish Republicans, are distancing themselves from Trump, but they're doing it when they still want to stay in the political game. They're doing it in a much more couch terms than finally, Mark Klein is like, no, forget January 6th, forget Charlottesville. This is the line I'm not willing to cross. Dinner with Kanye. Okay, fine. At least he has a line. Yeah. Some of these other guys, as long as they're still in politics, I don't know what their line is. If it's not this dinner with Nazis, I don't know what your line is. That you're still gonna not disavow yourself from this guy. Backing up from that, I did watch the Jon Stewart interview again today, and I agree with a lot of what he said in terms of meeting people where they are and hearing where the Black community comes from and their history and why they might be more susceptible to certain anti-Semitic views that are completely untrue. The thing that bothered me the most about what he said was that and he's always done this. He tries to be all serious and make a serious point, but then when you call him on it, it's like, but I'm just a comedian. Why are you, he tries to play both sides, and he's saying the same thing about Dave Chappelle. Yep. Well, if you're offended, he's just telling jokes, but you have to meet him where he's at because it's a serious point. You can't have it both ways, I feel like.
Yep, I hear you. I agree.
My question was, when I was actually in Glass as a member, we had a town hall meeting with Glass and Jonathan Greenblatt, which was great. I was asking him anything. And I asked him a pretty tough question. I asked at the time, there was talk that Israel might annex part of the West Bank. And there was a lot of concern about it. And it's, all right, what is the ADL going to do if this happens? If they cross this Rubicon, obviously still support Israel as a state, but how do you handle the legitimate criticism of a lot of people that look at this and say, well, how is this different than apartheid? And he didn't actually have to answer it at the time because it didn't happen. But I feel like now we really do have to answer it. And I want to know what is the thought coming down the pipeline of how they're going to start. I thought the statement I emailed David Goldenberg at the time when they first came out after the election and said, we are very concerned congratulations to Netanyahu, but we're concerned about the racist people he's looking to bring into his government. As someone who supports Israel's security and democracy, we think this is a mistake. That balance is going to get even harder. How are they looking to thread that needle?
Yeah, Dan, yeah, thank you for asking that. Yeah, so what I can tell you is our International Affairs Department, we are always monitoring what's going on. And as a part of that too, we are every single day, we're looking at what's happening. I know the government, as the Israeli Knesset, is now being formed as we speak. I think they actually just finally came to an official agreement today. And I think part of that is having to wait to see of what actually comes out of the pipeline. I can tell you now that me personally, I mean, there are like Ben-Gvir, for instance. He has made statements. I think Dan knows this, but I'm happy to share. I'm actually a Jewish convert. I actually converted under conservative Judaism. And there are comments that Ben-Gvir has made who argued like, well, if you don't convert under Orthodox Judaism, you don't have a right to come here to Israel. That's offensive to me as someone who's a Jewish professional and someone, right? So it's like there are things that, however, that we need to see. I know statements are being made. But part of it too is we are monitoring to see what exactly the Israeli government, this new government, is going to do. What are they going to try to implement? And I think, Dan, to your question, then it's going to have to come to a question of like, we're going to support Israel, but where do we make that distinction between we don't support this specific policy, but we still support the government, or we still support the country? That's an ongoing discussion. We're going to see how this goes, and we're going to see specifically with this government, what policies are they going to try to implement, knowing that they obviously lean farther right than the previous government did. So it's a wait and see.
To be determined. All right.
Yep.
Thanks.
Howard?
Hi, Dana Bash had this special on anti-Semitism, and I predicted to this group that she would not address Christianity as a source of anti-Semitism, and was not surprised. The Catholic Church, late, but in fact, removed the notion of collective guilt for Jews for the deicide, and also in kind of a backdoor way, while still maintaining that the only way, normal way, I guess, to salvation is through the Catholic Church and Jesus. Jesus, by his grace, can allow Jews in what they themselves term as a mystery. But that's at least better than what I see happening on the evangelical side, because a literal reading, which a lot of fundamentalists prescribe as the way to read it, of the Bible is really, really ugly. And I haven't seen any evangelical person, while they love Jews and Israel, either publicly renounce collective guilt or say that Jews can go to heaven. Many are explicit that they can't, except through Christ. So my question is twofold. One is that addressable and by the ADL or anybody? And second, if it is it being addressed?
Yeah. So I can tell you that, no, thank you for bringing it up, because it is, whether it's the Catholic Church, a number of like mainstream Protestant organizations have disavowed that idea, that collective guilt, that all Jews are responsible. And it goes back to, even though that is the case, there are still a number of American Christians who still hold on to those beliefs. And I think part of it comes down to obviously there are thousands of synagogues in the United States. There are probably tens of thousands of churches that exist across the country. And you can have one random pastor or one random reverend somewhere in the country make these horrible statements, and everybody latches on and believes to them. All right, there's still work to be done of saying, no, as a Catholic Church, we are not supporting this. As priests, right? Please do not mention this, right? Please understand that this is the policy. You don't go off script. You don't go off of whatever you believe, that as a Catholic Church, this is what we believe. I think the same thing could be said amongst a lot of Protestant denominations as well too. But one of the things that we do at ADL is we are a very big believer in coalition building. In fact, we have formal partnerships with groups like the National Urban League that serves the African American community, with the NAACP, with LULAC, which serves the Latin American community. There's actually within JUF, there is I've been to the last couple of meetings, I've been super busy, but there's actually a working group amongst Jewish leaders and Presbyterian leaders here in Chicago that we get together with and we have conversations with. And I would argue that it's important that leaders continue to work together, talk together, like when things pop up, and that when something happens within a certain marginalized community, we all speak up. Because like I said, at the end of the day, EDL, we are an anti-hate group. We're not just focused in on anti-Semitism. We're going to call out hate when it happens to any group that it does happen to. How does that work within Christian groups? I'm hoping that it's one of those things that religious leaders step up within Christian and Jewish organizations and say that we have this responsibility as to our congregants to explain that this is not okay to be teaching this. And from ADL's perspective, I think part of it is educating, going to as many schools as we possibly can to explain why these ideas are problematic. So it's going to be, I don't think it's a one organization fix, but I think it's one of those things we have to spread that message to as many people as possible, especially to kids.
Thank you. Wayne.
Thank you, and thanks for the presentation. I want to be very careful how I say this because I don't want it to be taken wrong. But I want to take a little bit of issue with you with the comment you made before about there are some things that are not two sides on. And you specifically mentioned the Holocaust, and there's no question, of course, that it was a horrific part of this world's history, and what was done was terrible. But I think that I would think, or I would hope that somebody was talking about a balanced approach. I'm sorry. A balanced approach would also mention this too. I know that members of my own family and my wife's family will never go to Germany, will never buy a German car. And so I think that it's important as we teach about the Holocaust and how horrific it was at that time. We also don't want to install in a new generation a hatred for Germany, which, as your survey showed, has actually made great strides to make restitution or whatever there, and has done great things. So I think that when we talk about there are no two sides, we got to be a little bit careful and say that there is an argument that I think if I was teaching the Holocaust, for example, that I would make, and that is that we can't generalize about an entire country, the present generation of an entire country, based on what was done those many years ago, because we don't really want to foster, as I said, hatred on our part or our generation's part for a current generation, which seems to me, we have a cousin who went there and said it's just amazing what they've been doing in Germany to try to address that terrible part of their history.
Yeah, Wayne, thank you. I agree with you.
And the other, I want to go, and I also want to make a point about the Jon Stewart stuff, because what upset me that night when I listened to him was what I consider a real double standard that seems to me a little bit unfair. Because I think what Stewart was trying to say is that, when people have these feelings, that we should hear them out and let them say what they want to say. I think, and rightly so in my mind, when comments are made that are racist involving Black Americans or African Americans, there is no question that the assumption is, no, you can't say that, and don't say that, and whatever. A very, very strong reaction. Nobody says, let's let him talk a little bit and see why he feels this way or anything like this. And I found that night when I was listening to him getting a little bit angry about the fact that there are certain things that can be said about Jews that should be the same way. Yeah. And in fact, and about gays and about whatever, that, Jeff sort of said it before, just because you may have a right to say it doesn't mean that there should be no consequences for you if you do. And so that's what was when I saw the Stewart interview, that's what bothered me about that I thought, clearly if despicable comments were made about African Americans, he'd be all over it. And as well he should. Let me make that clear, as well he should. But when it came to Jews, it's not quite the same. And I disagree with that.
The thing that troubles me too is that a lot of individuals who are spewing this venom and who have as many followers as you see with the Kanye West and Kyrie Irving, is that even if they ultimately see the light and realize that their comments were misguided and inappropriate, that if they're remorseful and are apologetic, that everybody hears the initial comments, but they don't hear the retraction. And that's the reason why these words are so dangerous, because you only hear the bad stuff, but you never hear what happens afterward.
Yep.
Vera.
I just want to make a few comments really quickly. One thing about their first comic, I can't say his name, unfortunately. What I think the problem is not when he said that there are many Jews in Hollywood, because this is true. This is just facts, okay, for better or worse. But when he said that there is many blacks in whatever other place, I don't remember the name of it. Right, and they don't have any power. I think that was wrong, because it put two people against each other, for one thing. And another thing, I think, well, Jews made themselves relevant, and this group should try harder to make themselves relevant. We should help them, of course, but I don't like this tension between two groups. The second comment I want to make is about what Daniel was saying. We support this country, whether we have government that we hate or we have government that we like. And I don't understand why we should hate or love Israel based on what government they have. And actually, Israel is much easier to work with, because in a year, this government can be gone, okay? So Israelis select their government. We need to support Israel, whether we like their government or not. We can fight for what we like, but support should not be withdrawn. The third one I think I can't remember now, but one that I really think is very important, that I've been saying this for a long time. When we work with Jewish groups, it's kind of that we preach to the choir. What we really need in terms of PR for Jews and for Israel is to make major alliances with non-Jewish groups and make them to talk about problem with anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism or something like this, because then their people will listen to this. Their people will, understand more history or more factual things than they do now. So I think this is of utmost importance, and I don't know if ADL is trying to deal with this or not.
Oh, no. Yeah, no. And I can say very quickly, we completely agree with you, Vera, about coalition building, and something we've been doing literally for decades. And I mentioned a few minutes ago, we have partnerships, formal partnerships, and actually one came out about 2 weeks ago with GLAAD. Right. So this GLAAD is one of the institutions that serves the LGBTQ community. We have formal partnerships with the National Urban League, which is an organization that serves primarily African Americans. We have a partnership with LULAC, which is an organization that serves primarily the Latinx community, Latino community. So yeah, we definitely hear you in part of that. And we have a long history of coalition building and working with other groups to say, because at the end of the day, ADL was founded, it wasn't founded just for Jews, but we recognize that America would not be safe for Jews if it was not safe for other marginalized groups as well too. So part of that is there are strength in numbers, and when things happen, like for instance, when the nightclub in Colorado was shot up, right, and people were murdered, ADL spoke up, right, because it is like that. That's part of our mission too. So no, definitely hear you about building those relationships, continuing those relationships, and building those partnerships across the ethnic, religious, racial divide.
I just saw a note from Dan saying, who do you partner with on the Muslim side?
Yes, it is. I do believe at one point, don't quote me, but I think there was CARE at one point, and then with CARE, with the comments they made regarding Israel, and there was an incident that happened in San Francisco. There were issues regarding future work with that as well too. And Daniel, actually, I think you hit the nail around the head. Yeah. But yeah, there are also groups there. For instance, ADL, we have what's called our anti-hate table, where we help to lead, and there are people all across, like all groups that come together, and we try to partner with as well too. So it's one of those things, we partner with individuals or different groups, but then when groups come out and support people and they say Israel's committing genocide and Israel is a country that shouldn't exist, we have to stick with what we believe in and with who we are, right? So there's that balance of how do you work with someone who doesn't see eye to eye with you, right? How do you navigate? Is it worth reaching out to them, or are they so stuck in their beliefs and ways they don't want to hear a different perspective? That's something that ADL we're constantly working with.
Howard.
I thought I'd at least try for one unfair question.
Sure.
But it's this. It's a question of which syllable needs to get the most emphasis, and that goes back to whether or not rising anti-Semitism is a thing in itself, or whether it's part of this kind of terrible rising tide of ethno-nationalist hate that's going on in this country, and whether fighting, just or emphasizing the Jewish side of the fight, given limited resources, somehow ends up losing the battle or being less effective because it's this bigger thing that's happening that we're part of.
Absolutely. Yeah. And what I can comment about that is that, and it goes back to what I was saying a couple of minutes ago about the importance of coalition building. And to your point, especially with right-wing extremism, with neo-Nazi groups and skinheads and Klan members, rarely are they just anti-Semitic. Most of the time they are racist and they are sexist and they're homophobic, right? And so part of the understanding of coalition building is they don't just hate us, they hate a wide variety of individuals, right? And so part of that is making sure we have those partnerships when things happen, that we call them out. And when we're doing research, we have some analysts that focus just on left-wing extremism within our Center on Extremism. We have others, we have an in-house analyst, for instance, that focuses in on right-wing extremism. And oftentimes, like I said, with neo-Nazis, what they're saying is not just anti-Semitic, it is racist, it is sexist, and it's homophobic as well too. And so part of that too is the understanding that a lot of these groups don't just hate us, they hate a lot of other individuals as well too. We have to call out all hatred in all of its forms.
Jerry, I think you had your hand up, and then we're going to hear from Barbara.
Trent, thank you very much for your presentation. My question has to do with how do you deal with the national press with regard to anti-Semitism?
Yep. So thankfully here, especially I'll give you an example here at ADL Midwest, our regional director, David Goldenberg, we have a number of great relationships with the Chicago Tribune and the Sun-Times, WGN, other things. And oftentimes when things pop up, we hear news stories. ADL is one of the first organizations that these news agencies will reach out to. Give you an example, when the desecration and vandalism at the cemetery in Waukegan happened, the reporter from, I think it was Chicago 10, SBC, CBS, one of the people actually reached out directly to David because he has that great partnership and said, are you familiar with this? What's going on? What happened? And thankfully, David was able to be included in that story to make those statements. That's just one example on the local level, but thankfully our ADL, our national office, we have relationships with CNN and MSNBC and the New York offices and things of that nature. So when these things happen, odds are one of the very first calls they are going to make when a case of extremism or anti-Semitism happens, that they're calling ADL. They're calling us because they want to know, what do you know about this group? What do you know about these individuals? What can you comment on? What information can you give us that we can share out to the public? So I would say largely our relationship with media is very strong because of those people-to-people relationships that we have.
Thank you. Barbara?
If Dave Chappelle was Jewish, if he was Aaron Freeman, for example, would we still find his comments to be as offensive? I mean, were they per se offensive? Or if he was Jewish, would we be giving him the benefit of the doubt?
Barbara, that's a good question. I know that's open for debate. I would actually point out, give you an example. So Kanye West, or Ye, has made a number of very controversial comments over the last 15 years. And one of the comments that he made was that he looked to the African-American community and said, well, you know, slavery was a choice. You didn't have to be slaves. And there were a number of African-Americans who came out and said, that is horrendous. It is horrible that you would say such a thing. I would hope that if somebody in the Jewish community were to say something as outrageous as something like that, there would be a number of Jewish individuals and Jewish leaders in our country and in Israel who would call that out. I would hope.
Okay, I had a last question, unless somebody else has a question. Just maybe Vera, you're beyond your quota.
The last one, I wanted to ask, and this is what I forgot. Are we too sensitive?
It's
It doesn't
interesting.
mean we need to fight it, but
Yeah.
are we too sensitive? We just like take every comment, everything. I am really happy that I am, well, or my people are in charge of a lot of things. Okay,
Yeah.
we did it because of our persuasion, because of our culture, because our, being assertive. Whatever. I don't see any problems with that. Follow us.
Yeah. The comment I would make to that is I would leave it up to each individual, right, about whether it offends or not, right? Because we all have, different levels of emotion, but it goes back to what I had mentioned earlier, which is the comments that were made by Dave Chappelle, specifically Kanye West or Kyrie Irving or things of that nature. It's not just the comments themselves, right? Are they offensive or are they harmful? Do they make them uncomfortable? Absolutely, right? I was watching Dave Chappelle's monologue, and I'll be completely honest, Dave Chappelle is one of my favorite comedians. When I saw him make that monologue, yeah, I got kind of uncomfortable too, listening to it, right? But in my mind, it's not so much about how it makes me feel, how I would argue here at ADL. It's the fact that, once again, these celebrities, thanks to Twitter and social media, they can reach millions and millions of people. I actually rewatched Dave Chappelle's monologue on YouTube, and it was, I think, a few days ago. It now has 14 or 15 million views. There are 14 or 15 million people who have now watched that monologue, probably multiple times by now. So it's not just the comments themselves, not about whether it's making us uncomfortable or not. It's the fact that we know there are people in this country that don't understand Jewish people. They don't have a full grasp of who we are. And they're going to listen to anything that their favorite celebrity says, and they're going to latch onto it and take it as truth. That's the problem. That's where education comes into play, and speaking out and saying, you're a celebrity, you need to do better, because you have so many people who are following you.
Yeah, I'd answer your question, Vera, by saying, yes, we are oversensitive, and we're justified. Because when you talk about anti-Semitism being the longest hatred, anything that you feel is going to fan the flames of anti-Semitism makes us ultra sensitive, even if it may not be true, but we're worried about anything that's said that might motivate somebody toward having negative feelings about us. So we are, but why shouldn't we be? That's my answer to that. Howard?
Yeah, one more question, because it disturbs me a little. Anti-Defamation League is pretty careful about when they raise alarms, but I noticed that there are a number of organizations that raise anti-Semitic alarms when the underlying facts are either just wrong or overstated. And I was wondering if ADL has some concerns about that.
Howard, could you give me an example, like specifically,
Specifically, you're in Chicago. There was this purported incident about an anti-Semitic attack on Jews at, I think, at a Beis Yaakov bus.
Yep.
It turns out that that hit the press, and it hit the the raise alarms about anti-Semitism thing pretty quickly. And it turns out that, at least according to the JTA, the events just didn't happen.
Yeah.
Okay, similar story about anti-Semitism at the Berkeley Law School.
Yeah. Absolutely. No, okay. Thank you, Howard. I appreciate that, because I familiar with what happened, specifically like with the bus incident a couple of weeks ago. At ADL, we are very careful before we put something out there, we want to make sure it's verified. And part of it is we actually get criticized because it's, ADL, it happened yesterday. Why didn't you guys comment on it immediately? Well, there were other Jewish organizations that commented on it immediately. And it turns out that, to your point, we all know that it was actually not an act of anti-Semitism. All right, so before we go out, and we're, especially for non-Jewish audiences, when we're going out into people where we want to say this is happening, we want to make sure that we're verified. And so because of that, we are not, oftentimes ADL, we are not the very first organization that speaks on it, because we want to make sure internally we know what we're talking about. We want to make sure that what happened, in fact, did happen before we put our public statement out there, to avoid actually that situation from happening.
Okay, I think that carries us to the end of the session today. Trent, I can't thank you enough.
Thank you.
For being so generous with your time and for just giving us an outstanding presentation. So for the rest of you, I will see you next week, and it'll be one of our normal sessions. So you'll have your opportunity to truly vent. You'll feel a lot better. All right, see you in a week. Thank you so much. Thanks again, Trent.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you.